A very warm welcome to the 14th of February, so that's Valentine's Day. And for Valentine's Day, we are joined by Joe, who's going to talk to us about a range of our fantastic whiskies on our core list and core offering. As I said, you should have some of the little samples in front of you as we go through the session. As per all the sessions so far, please make sure that you are on mute, and please also make sure if you've got any questions, pop them on the chat and we will tackle the questions at the end of the call today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Joe, who will be taking us through today's session.
Thank you, Richard. Well, hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Just to introduce myself very briefly before we get into the chat about the whiskies and the brands. I've been working in whiskey in one way or other for nearly 12 years now, so I've got a little bit of bar experience. I've got quite a lot of luxury retail experience in the whiskey trade, and I've also got coming up to 7 years working for Edrington. Right, I'm just going to chuck my dog out for 2 seconds. Hang on, sorry. Before he just barks the entire time. Sorry, guys. Apologies for that. Right. So that's just a little introduction to me. So we've got half an hour. I understand that you have covered production in quite a lot of detail. So we won't revisit the production of whiskey, but we might touch on some of the quirks of production for the particular brands that Edrington UK look after in our portfolio. So I'm just going to share my screen. Again, I apologise if you can hear my dog in the background, but if any of you have dogs, you'll know what they're like. So what we're going to talk briefly about is the regions of whiskey production. Now, these days, the regional styles aren't necessarily as important for defining a style as they once were, but it's still a really good place to start, especially if you overhear some of your guests talking about the fact that they like Islay whiskies, or they like Speyside whiskies, or they might say, oh, I'm a big fan of the Lowland style. Now, it's really important that you guys actually kind of understand what your guests are talking about when they might say, I like Islay whiskey, or I like Speyside whiskey, because what they're referring to really is a generic style. And we're going to be tasting today a Lowland, a Speyside, and an Islay. All three of those are very distinctly different from one another. So the Lowlands traditionally would be quite light, often triple distilled, and Lowland whiskey was often referred to as breakfast whiskey because it was, it's like so light you could potentially perceivably drink it at breakfast time, although I don't recommend that, obviously. The Highlands, as you can see, it's such a big region. So there's not one particular Highland style, but if you compare, I guess, a generic Highland style to a generic Lowland style, then the Highland styles are much richer, much more full-bodied. I like to think of them as the Werther's originals of the whiskey world, if that makes sense. So a bit more buttery, a bit more kind of toffee, those kind of flavors. Then within the Highlands, you have this separate area called Speyside, and Speyside is where some of the biggest brands in the world, in the world of Scotch whiskey, come from. So brands like the Macallan, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Balvenie, and what those whiskies all share in style is a sort of distinct fruitiness, if you like. So Macallan, very well known for using sherry seasoned casks, so that has given the whiskey a particular fruitiness from using those casks. So that is Speyside style in a nutshell: fruity, approachable, very, very easy going. Then you move on to the various islands, and the various islands, most of the islands now have their own distillery. And island whiskey tends to reflect the location, so a rugged, robust, windswept coastal island of Scotland. So you'll find that island whiskies tend to be kind of coastal in style, so they may have a certain coastal saltiness to them. They might be quite, heavy flavors. And one of those islands, a very, very important island, and it's a separate region in and of itself, is Islay, which we've got today. And within your sample packs, although we're not going to cover the other two brands, you have got a couple of other whiskies in that sample pack which you can enjoy in your own time. And Islay's famous for making very peaty, very particular whiskey. So if you've never tried an Islay whiskey before, they are smoky, they are phenolic, they are earthy, because of Islay having a lot of peat on the island. And then finally, you have Campbelltown, which again we're not going to really cover today, but Campbelltown, to me, it's an amalgamation of all the styles of Scotland. Some really nice whiskies coming from Campbelltown, but in the on-trade and even really in the off-trade, there's not a huge offering of Campbelltown whiskies. So in terms of the flavour of single malt Scotch whisky, some might argue that rum is the most diverse spirit in the world, and I think that's a very, very reasonable argument to make. But to me, and I think many others, I don't think there is a spirit quite as varied as Scotch single malt whisky, because of the use of sherry casks versus the use of bourbon casks versus sometimes you can use wine cask, let's say. You don't just have to stick with using just sherry casks. You can use sherry casks and you can use bourbon casks in the same batting. You can also use peat on various scales. So you can make a heavily peated whiskey or a completely unpeated whiskey. And again, you can mix all these different styles together. And often this does happen. So you can get whiskies that combine the use of sherry casks, bourbon casks, heavily peated and non-peated whiskey. So to me, there is really no other spirit quite as varied as Scotch single malt. And we're very, very lucky in our portfolio. We cover all of the styles of Scotch whisky. So heavily sherried, bourbon cask matured, peat and not peated, and everything in between. So getting on to the first whiskey. So you guys have got the Auchentoshan American Oak in your sample packs. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the 3-wood sent out, but I know that you have the 3-wood in your venues. So if you get the chance, you've got the miniature of the American Oak, and actually it'd be a really good shout to compare that directly to the 3-wood. The 3-wood is what we're going to be talking about today from a brand's point of view. And any questions you've got, please fire them away. But purely in terms of that taste, it's really good for you guys to be able to taste the American Oak versus the 3-wood, so you can really clearly see what the difference is. So that's our distillery. It's just outside of Glasgow city centre in Clydebank. Now, as you can probably see, there's like a block of flats in the background. There's a little sort of river, or the Clydebank. And it's really not in the most picturesque location. In fact, that's probably the best picture I've seen of the distillery, because the distillery literally sits on the side of a dual carriageway on the way to Glasgow city centre. So, you know, a lot of people, when they think of a Scottish distillery, you think of these amazing glens, these big valleys, these gorgeous sort of heather-strewn locations. But not all of them are like that. And Auchentoshan is very much this kind of urban location. But you've got to think, you know, back in the 1800s, when some of these distilleries, or a lot of these distilleries were being set up, they were being set up in locations that made it convenient for people to be able to get to. So they would naturally have been set up in, you know, built up areas. So in terms of what the brand means, it means corner of the field in the Gaelic language. I don't pretend to know how to speak Gaelic, but I know enough to talk about the certain whiskies and what they mean. So it means corner of the field in Gaelic. And Auchentoshan is how you would pronounce it. In terms of a little bit of a brief history, like a lot of distilleries, it's gone through a fair few different owners over the course of its lifespan. But it initially started with a chap called John Bullock, who was a corn merchant. And again, lots of original distillery owners were farmers that distillation was a means of preserving their crop. It then got passed through to a few different owners over the years, and then finally Beam Suntory bought the rights, or Suntory bought Beam, and they incorporated the brand into the portfolio. They've always been triple distilling their spirit. So at the moment, they're the only Scottish distillery to triple distill everything that they produce. And triple distillation, if you triple distill, what you're doing is you're raising the ABV of a spirit to a much higher strength. And what that means is you're taking it closer to a pure spirit, if you like. So they're trying to make the spirit as soft and as pure as they can. Now, what that means is you'll lose a little bit of the flavors of the malted barley, but what you gain is a really soft, light mouthfeel. And this is what I mean when we talk about traditional lowland whiskey. So this light, elegant style of single malt. And those are the three stills. So you've got your wash and your two spirit stills. And yeah, as I say, taking the spirit all the way up to 81% ABV. It'll then get watered down a little bit before it goes into cask. But because it's been taken up to such a high ABV, and because the spirit is slightly more neutral in style compared to just double distilled spirit, it means it is able to take on a lot more of the flavor from the wood. So when we get to the 3 wood, and the expression that all of your venues stock and sell, the 3 wood came about around about 15 or so years ago, due to the distillery and the blending team experimenting with different oaks. So they used to have what was roughly a 10-year-old bourbon matured single malt, and they were taking that spirit and they were putting it into various different types of sherry cask and wine cask. So to make the 3 wood, they take this bourbon matured whiskey and they transfer it into Oloroso sherry casks for around about a year. So Oloroso is usually a dry style of sherry, and it will give the whiskey like a nutty, slightly raisiny taste, a slightly kind of spicy flavor as well from the oak. And then for a final year, they transfer that stock to Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. And Pedro Jimenez, if any of you have tried it, you'll know that it's a sweetened style of sherry. And Pedro Jimenez literally tastes like you're drinking liquidized raisins. It is so sweet. It's thick. If you got some on your hands, it's like syrup. It's really, really sticky and sweet. It's a delicious, very dessert-like style of sherry. Not something that you could drink a lot of. In fact, a lot of people, they will use PX and put it onto ice cream and that kind of thing, and use it in affogato, desserts and that sort of stuff. So that's the whiskey. So in terms of the taste of this, it is incredibly rich. It's been compared to sticky toffee pudding. It's been compared to like a Mars bar. I've heard people describe it as like a Cadbury fruit and nut bar, like dates and raisins and those sorts of flavors. So it kind of flies in the face of what would traditionally be a lowland style, being like light and grassy and floral. This is quite it's quite a dessert-like whiskey. So when you're thinking about what your guests could enjoy and when they could enjoy whiskey, this would be definitely an after the dinner style of whiskey. That's what I would kind of recommend in terms of like a good time for people to drink it, because it's a pretty rich flavor. Cool. I'm conscious of time, so it's already almost 20 past, so we're going to move swiftly on. I'm now going to talk about the Macallan. So we're moving up to Speyside now, that northeastern area of Scotland, sort of around the kind of Aberdeenshire area. And Speyside now is where the bulk of whiskey production takes place in Scotland. And as I said before, Speyside whiskies generally share this very fruity, very, very approachable style. And Macallan is no exception. And there's a few things that make Macallan the brand it is today, one of which is our spiritual home. This is our Easter Elkis house, which is a Jacobean manor built in 1700 out of locally sourced sandstone. It's still there today, where we will use it for hosting VIP visits and dinners and that kind of thing. Our award-winning distillery, which was rebuilt built new in 2017, increasing our capacity, but still retaining the same style of spirit and same style of stills. Now, what makes the Macallan spirit unique is we have these very, very small spirit stills. And when you use a small spirit still, you're creating a much richer, much more complex style of spirit, kind of oilier, kind of thicker. And There's a few other distilleries in Speyside that have small stills like this. So it's kind of synonymous with the area. But what it means is when we put it into the casks, there's this amazing interaction between this richness of the spirit and then the rich flavors we get from our exceptional oak sherry seasoned casks. Now, Macallan, at this point, we are only filling sherry seasoned casks. In the past, we've used bourbon barrels. We have used, the odd wine cask here and there. But from today or from last year, at some point, we are only filling sherry seasoned casks. And the reason we would use sherry seasoned casks over bourbon casks is we have a lot more control over exactly what happens to those casks during the cask making process. When you're buying bourbon barrels, which is absolutely fine, and Macallan used to do it, you're basically reliant on the American distilleries creating those casks and looking after those casks. And also, when bourbon's gone into a cask, because it's a high strength spirit, it's taken a lot of the oak flavors out of that cask before it gets to Scotland. By using sherry casks, because sherry is a much lower ABV alcoholic drink compared to a bourbon spirit, which is around about 62% when it goes into a cask, that sherry hasn't taken as much of the oak compounds and oak flavor out of the casks. So you have a lot more flavor from the actual oak to play around with. We also can dedicate time and research into exactly how long and at what temperature we toast those casks for to develop incredible flavors. And we'll use a combination of American oak and European oak when we are maturing Macallan. So the double cask 12 is what you've got there. So hopefully you're all having a little nose and a little taste. The double cask 12 is, as the name suggests, a combination of American oak sherry seasoned cask matured whiskey and European oak sherry seasoned cask matured whiskey. All of those casks have been matured for at least 12 years before they're all vatted together to make each batch. So it's not a finishing process. It's not, 6 years in American oak casks and then 6 years in European oak casks. It's full 12-year maturation in both those cask types and then vatted together. So that again is a really important thing to note, that it's not a finish, it is full maturation. And hopefully what you're tasting is a lot of that kind of raisin, there's a lot of caramel, there's a lot of toffee there. There's some really nice gentle wood spices. So you might get a little bit of nutmeg, you might get a touch of clove, but there's not a huge amount of that oak bitterness that you can sometimes get from using a lot of European oak. And I think for me, that's the real beauty of the double cask range, is this lovely balance between American oak and between European oak. And hopefully, again, compared to the Auchentoshan, you get a lovely, rich, kind of complex, oily style of mouthfeel. And it's quite an approachable flavor as well. That kind of it sings to me Speyside. So again, if you have guests talking about Speyside whiskies, or if they're mentioning the brands like Glenfiddich or Glenlivet or Balvenie, and they want to try something different, then Macallan will fall in to the same style of those styles of whiskey. So again, these are all conversations that you can have with the guests to kind of elevate their experience beyond, I'd recommend just this. It's that way you can have a bit more interaction with your guests. Cool. Also, just before we move on to the last whiskey, some whiskey brands, and this is absolutely fine to do, and lots of cognac and rum brands do it. Some whiskey brands and spirits brands would add caramel colouring to their spirits. Macallan do not add any colour. So the colour you see in the bottles are purely from the casks and the casks alone, and it's the job of the whiskey making team to be able to create a consistent colour across the range. And then finally on to Bowmore and Islay. So Islay is this lovely little island off the west coast of Scotland. Hopefully some of you may have been there. If you haven't, and you are kind of whiskey enthusiasts, and at some point in your life, I really urge you to make the pilgrimage to Islay, because it is an amazing amazing place, and you'll love it, especially if you're a fan of Islay whiskey or just whiskey in general. So this is a little map of Islay. Bowmore, or if you want to be really correct and pedantic, and especially if you're speaking to a Scottish person or you're speaking to someone who is clearly a whiskey enthusiast, the correct pronunciation would be Bowmore. That is how the Iliacs, the island natives, will pronounce the distillery. So Bowmore is the correct pronunciation, but lots of people in the industry say Bowmore. So I guess I will leave it up to you to choose how to pronounce it. So Bowmore's right in the centre. It's also the capital of Islay. It's also the very, very first distillery recorded on Islay, all the way back in 1779. It's also got the oldest whiskey maturation warehouse in the world, and they've been distilling in this location ever since 1779. Then, like a lot of distilleries, it's had a various different ownerships over the years, and then finally Suntory took ownership back in 1994. Now, in terms of the production at Bowmore, we're one of 7 distilleries that are operating its own malting floor. And it's this malting floor where they will malt a proportion of the barley, which is around about 25%, which gives Bowmore its own unique character. The distilleries that do have their own malting floors, they don't do it because it's cheap. It's actually very expensive to run a malting floor, but they do it to give character. And what they say the character is, running through all the Bowmores, is a note of tropical fruits, especially with the very, very highly aged Bowmores. So without this, you wouldn't get the flavour that you do. So 25% of the malting will be done on site at this malting floor, and it's all turned by hand, as you can see there. And 75% of it will be bought in from the Port Ellen maltings on Islay. Now, Bowmore is peated, but Bowmore is always about a balance of peat. It's not about a really, really heavily peated Islay style like Laphroaig's. So what Bowmore do, yes, they do use Islay peat, but they then also use mainland peat as well. And mainland peat burns and gives off a different smoke to the way Islay peat burns and the flavour it gives off. And the best way I can describe it is Islay peat is all about the medicinal, this kind of TCP, quite iodine-y flavour. And mainland peat is more that wood smoke, more rootsy, more earthy, and more peppery. So combining those two peats, you get a really, really nice balanced flavour. So those two peated barleys are combined, and then we will mature it in a mixture of different casks. The most highly prized expressions are matured in our #1 vaults, which is on site right next to the sea. And then the 15 that you will have there is one of our all-time classic Bowmores. It was one of the first whiskies that I tried when I first got into the industry, and it just blew me away with its complexity and its richness. So in terms of how that whiskey is put together, around 50% of it is aged in bourbon casks. Around 50% is matured in sherry seasoned casks. And then 30% of that liquid is then taken and finished for 3 years in first fill sherry casks. So you've got a hefty amount of sherry cask influence going on here, alongside this lovely, gentle peat smoke. The peat's there compared to other peated whiskies, but it is quite gentle. It's quite approachable in its style. This is a great whiskey with food, so blue cheese, like sort of oily seafood, dark chocolate, and it's just one of those great whiskies for the end of the night. If you guys stock the Bowmore 12, the Bowmore 12 is a mixture of bourbon and sherry seasoned casks, and again, it's just quite a nice balanced flavour of smoke. It's a bit more toffed, it's a bit lighter than the 15, and yeah. So that is about half an hour. I will now open it up to questions.
Guys, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or just drop them in the chat as always. I suppose something we were just talking while you were presenting, Joe.
One question, Richard.
Yeah, go on, Heavy.
How do we put the peat taste into the whiskey?
So what we will do is part of that malting process is you have to dry the barley, and most distilleries will dry it with hot air. So they will use a smokeless fuel that looks like coal. Once the barley has been dried using this smokeless fuel, they will then fill the kiln with peat, and that peat will basically burn. It will produce a lot of smoke, and the smoke will go up a kiln chimney where all that dried barley is sat, and the smoke will infuse into the barley itself.
Does that answer your question, Heavy? So I'm surrounded by whiskey.
Yes, I did put my thumbs up. Yes, yeah, no.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Question we had here was, out of the whiskies that we tried today, the Auchentoshan, the Macallan, and the Bowmore, which would be the one that would be the most approachable for someone that was new to whiskey, or was not very confident ordering a whiskey in the bar?
I would say probably 95% of the time, I would say Macallan. But honestly, it can really, really vary. So I've been doing this job a long time, and I do a lot of training sessions where we will try lots of these different whiskies, and I'll often find that when you get to the smoky whiskies, people way prefer them to stuff like Macallan and Auchentoshan. So it can vary, but I would probably say the much safer bet is Macallan.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, guys? Well, if not, I will just share screen again. So thank you very much indeed for your time today, Joe. It's been interesting, and really thank you for providing all the hotels with little tasting sets. And the great thing is they fit in a liquid bag, so I can take them home. Tomorrow we're joined by the team at Absolute. You've also got some samples for tomorrow's session, so look out for those. Same time, same place, 4 o'clock on Zoom, and we look forward to seeing as many as possible tomorrow for the session on Absolute Vodka. But from everyone at MHTV that's joined the call today, just want to say a big thank you to Joe for your time taking us through these 3 wonderful spirit brands today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.